The first thing you should know is how quiet it was. In October of 2020, on the north edge of downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma, a small team of archaeologists and forensic scientists gathered at the edge of Oak Lawn Cemetery. They stood over a patch of ordinary ground, the kind of ground you would walk across without a second thought. There were no monuments here, no names, only grass, and the low autumn light, and the sound of a backhoe idling somewhere behind them. They had come to test a rumor almost 100 years old. You have to understand what these people were. They were not treasure hunters. They were not conspiracy theorists. They were state-funded experts working under the eyes of the city, with cameras present and protocols in place. Many of them expected to find nothing at all. The whole point of the dig was to rule things out, to put an old, ugly story finally to rest. And for the first hours, that is exactly what seemed to be happening. Empty soil, disturbed clay, the ordinary disappointments of any excavation. Then the trowels found wood. Not one coffin, not two. A row of them. Then another suggestion of a row beneath it. Simple wooden boxes laid close together in a long trench in a corner of the cemetery where the records insisted no one had ever been buried at all. Let us be careful here, because this is where the story begins to turn. The investigators did not shout. There were no dramatic announcements. The lead scientist, choosing her words slowly, described what they had found as consistent with a mass grave. That is the language professionals use when they are standing over something they already understand but cannot yet prove. A mass grave. In a public cemetery, in an American city, in a living memory. And here is the detail that should sit with you. The cemetery's own paperwork, the ledgers, the plot maps, the official municipal record of who lies where, said this ground was empty. According to the documents that the city of Tulsa had kept for a century, the people in those coffins did not exist. Someone had buried them. And then someone had made sure the paper said no one had. To understand how those boxes ended up there, unrecorded and unmourned, you have to go back. Not to a battlefield, not to a distant century. You have to go back to a single American spring and to a neighborhood that, for a brief and luminous moment, was one of the most prosperous black communities in the entire United States. They called it Greenwood. In 1921, the Greenwood district of Tulsa was something close to a miracle, and the people who lived there knew it. 35 city blocks of black-owned wealth, built by people who had been born into slavery or born to those who had. There were grocery stores and tailors, 2 newspapers, 2 theaters, a hospital, doctors and lawyers and dentists with their own practices. There were brick homes with pianos in the parlors. There were children walking to school past banks owned by men who looked like them. A man named Booker T. Washington is said to have called it the Negro Wall Street. In time, the country would shorten it to Black Wall Street. The dollar circulated there neighbor to neighbor for a long time before it ever left. Picture an ordinary morning on Greenwood Avenue, the smell of bread, the sound of a streetcar, a barber sweeping his step before the first customer arrives, a young woman in a clerk's job downtown, a shoeshine boy named Dick Rowland, 19 years old, walking toward the Drexel building because the building where he worked had no restroom for someone of his color, and the one he was permitted to use was on the top floor of another. He stepped into the elevator. A young white woman named Sarah Page was operating it. What happened in that elevator in the next few seconds, no one has ever truly established. Perhaps he stumbled. Perhaps he stepped on her foot. Perhaps he reached out to steady himself and touched her arm. She cried out. He fled. A clerk heard her, saw a black youth running, and assumed the worst that the era trained. White men to assume. That is all it was, a stumble, a scream, a door opening and closing in the space of a breath. And from that, nothing, from that single trivial human moment, the machinery began to move. By the next afternoon, Dick Rowland was in a cell. By that evening, a white crowd was gathering at the courthouse with a word already on its lips, a word that, in 1921 Oklahoma, was less a threat than a promise. The men of Greenwood, many of them veterans, men who had carried rifles for this country in France only 3 years before, heard that word too. and they made a decision that would be used forever after to blame them for what was done to them. They decided to go and protect that boy. It began at the courthouse on the night of May 31st, 1921. The black men who came, perhaps 25 at first, then more, some armed, all afraid, came for one reason. They had heard what crowds like the white crowd gathering that evening had done in other towns, in other years, to other boys held in other cells. They had read the morning paper. So they offered their help to the sheriff, were turned away and left. And then, as the white crowd swelled into the hundreds, they came back. What happened next is disputed in its smallest details and beyond dispute in its outline. There was a confrontation on the courthouse steps. A white man tried to disarm a black veteran. A shot was fired, no one knows by whom. And in an instant, the thing everyone had feared and no one had quite believed would happen, happened. By dawn, Greenwood was burning. We have to slow down here because the speed is the point. The violence itself lasted less than a day. From the first shot to the last fire, perhaps 18 hours. In that single turning of the earth, a community 35 blocks wide, built over a generation, brick by careful brick, was reduced to ash and standing chimneys. And then came the silence, and the silence lasted 50 years. Consider how quickly it descended. Within days, the local papers that had helped light the fire began to look away from it. An inflammatory article in the Tulsa Tribune, the one that historians believe helped summon the mob, was later found to be missing. Not misplaced. Removed. The relevant page had been cut from the bound archive, and the microfilm record of it was gone. To this day, no one has produced the original text. Someone, at some point, decided that those particular words should not survive. That is a small thing, a single clipped page, but it tells you the shape of what was coming. The grand jury convened, and the grand jury, an all-white body in an all-white legal system, reached its conclusion. The riot, it found, had been caused by the black residents of Greenwood. The men who had come to the courthouse to prevent a lynching were named as the instigators of their own destruction. Almost no white Tulsan was ever meaningfully punished for what had been done. The dead were black. The blame was black. The matter was closed. Now watch what happens to the survivors. Greenwood's residents filed insurance claims. They had paid their premiums after all on homes and shops now turned to cinders. Nearly every claim was denied. The insurers invoked riot clauses, language that excused them from paying for damage caused by civil disorder. The community had been destroyed by a mob, so the community would not be compensated for the mob. The logic was airtight and obscene. The city, for its part, did something quieter and stranger. It moved to rezone the burned district, to widen the fire codes in a way that would have made it nearly impossible for black families to rebuild on their own land. The land, you see, was valuable. It sat near the railroad and the growing downtown. There were men who had wanted it before the fire, and the fire had a way of clearing title. That ordinance was eventually struck down. The people of Greenwood, with almost nothing, did rebuild. But understand what was attempted. In the very weeks after the ashes cooled, the machinery of the city tried to ensure that the people who had lost everything could not return to claim what was left. And the witnesses? The witnesses learned not to speak. Black survivors carried the memory in whispers, passing it to children and grandchildren in the privacy of their own kitchens, because to speak of it in the open was to invite the violence back. White Tulsans, by and large, simply stopped mentioning it, not out of grief, but out of something closer to administrative convenience. It was left out of the city's histories. It was left out of the state's textbooks. Children grew up a few blocks from the graves and never learned the graves were there. There is a phrase scholars now use for what was done to the story itself. They call it the second wound. The first wound was the fire. The second was the erasing of the fire. The decades in which Tulsa and Oklahoma and the nation simply agreed, without ever quite saying so aloud, that this had not happened. A death toll was never honestly counted. The official figure offered at the time was around 36, but the Red Cross working on the ground with the wounded and the missing kept records suggesting a far higher number. Funeral directors later spoke, quietly, of being told to bury bodies without services, without records, without names. Survivors described trucks. They described trucks. They describe the trenches. They describe the river. And so we arrive at last back at that quiet corner of Oaklawn Cemetery, and the row of plain wooden boxes in ground the record swore was empty. Which leaves us with the question this entire story turns upon. A massacre is a terrible thing, but massacres, God help us, are not rare in human history. What is rarer, what is stranger, is the effort that came after. The clipped page, the denied claims, the rezoning, the missing graves, the 50 years of official forgetting. So we have to ask it plainly. It is one thing to commit a crime in a single night of fury. Why would they spend the next half-century making so very sure that no one would ever be able to prove it happened at all? To understand how a crime this large could be hidden for this long, you have to stop thinking about the mob and start thinking about the men who never picked up a torch. A riot is loud. Suppression is quiet, and it requires power. The slow, institutional kind. The kind held by people who sign documents and approve ordinances and decide what the newspaper will print and what the archive will keep. The mob burned Greenwood in a night. But the forgetting of Greenwood took decades, and it required the cooperation of nearly every respectable institution in the city. That is the part that should unsettle you. Consider who held that power in 1921 Tulsa. This was an oil boom town, suddenly and violently rich. Fortunes had been made in a single generation, and the men who made them sat on the city commission, owned the banks, ran the papers, and filled the roles of the very civic organizations whose members were later seen handing out weapons during the violence. The line between the official Tulsa and the mob Tulsa was not a wall. It was a curtain, and on the night of the fire, the curtain simply parted. This is the uncomfortable truth at the center of every great suppression. It is not usually the work of a shadowy few. It is the work of the many, acting in quiet agreement, each one preserving his own comfort by looking slightly away. No single man buried Greenwood. A whole city did, by consensus, by silence, by the thousand small decisions not to write it down. And here is where we must connect this to something larger. Because Greenwood was not an accident, and it was not unique. You may have heard it said in certain corners that history is full of hidden cities and erased civilizations, grand theories about whole worlds wiped from the record by powerful hands. I want to be honest with you, because honesty is the only currency this channel has. Those theories are almost always fantasies. They invent a conspiracy where there was none, and in doing so they insult the real ones. Because the real pattern of hidden history is not mystical, it is bureaucratic, and it is far more chilling. What happened to Greenwood happened, in its way, again and again across this country, and the method was almost always the same. There was the destruction of Rosewood, Florida in 1923, a black town burned, its survivors scattered, its name left off the maps and out of the schoolbooks for 60 years. There was the Elaine massacre in Arkansas in 1919, where the dead were counted in the dozens or the hundreds depending on who was permitted to count, and where the official story blamed the victims for years. There was a whole grammar of erasure, repeated town by town, decade by decade. This is the genuine, suppressed history of which Greenwood is a part, not a lost civilization beneath the mud, a lost truth buried beneath paperwork, beneath grand jury findings and insurance clauses, and clipped newspaper pages and the simple refusal of a textbook committee to include a chapter. The machinery of forgetting in America did not need magic. It needed only filing cabinets and the agreement of decent-seeming men to leave certain drawers closed. That is the pattern. And it is so consistent, so methodical, that once you learn to see it, you cannot stop seeing it. A community is destroyed, the victims are blamed, the compensation is denied, the records are altered or lost, and then, crucially, the next generation is simply never told. The forgetting is not an accident of time. It is engineered, and then it is inherited. Think about what that requires. It requires teachers who do not teach it, reporters who do not report it, officials who do not investigate it. It requires 100 small, ordinary people across 50 years, each making the small, ordinary choice to let it lie. The conspiracy, if you want to call it that, is not a meeting in a dark room. It is a society quietly agreeing on what it would prefer not to know about itself. And that, finally, is what makes Greenwood so important. Because Greenwood did not stay buried. The whispers in those North Tulsa kitchens did not stop. The grandmothers kept telling the grandchildren. A handful of historians kept pulling at the thread. And in 1997, the state of Oklahoma did something almost unheard of. It convened an official commission to investigate its own buried crime. The commission's report, delivered in 2001, did not flinch. It documented the massacre, estimated the dead far above the old official figure, and recommended that the city go looking for the graves the records insisted did not exist. It took another 20 years. But that recommendation is the reason the archaeologists were standing in Oaklawn Cemetery in the autumn of 2020. It is the reason the backhoe was idling. It is the reason the trowels found wood. So let us return to where we began, because now you can see it clearly. Those plain coffins in the unmarked trench are not just human remains. They are physical evidence in a 100-year-old case that the most powerful institutions in a city spent half a century trying to ensure would never be proven. The records said the ground was empty. The records were a lie. And the only question that remains is how complete that lie truly was. How many lie down there, who they were, and how they came to be put in the earth with no name, no service, and no stone. So let us look, as closely as the evidence allows, at what is actually in that ground, and at the two ways honest people weeded. Start with what the witnesses described, because the witnesses came first, long before any archaeologist. For decades, survivors and their children spoke of things they had seen with their own eyes in the days after the fire. They spoke of bodies stacked in trucks. They spoke of a long trench at Oaklawn. Some spoke of bodies thrown into the Arkansas River. Some of bodies taken out of the county entirely to be disposed of where no Tulsa record would ever touch them. One often repeated account described a man who, as a boy, watched workers loading the dead and was told, in no uncertain terms, to forget what he had seen. These were not wild stories. They were specific, consistent, and they came from people who had no reason to invent them, and every reason to stay silent. That consistency is itself a kind of evidence. Then, in 2020 and 2021, the physical record began to catch up to the oral one. At Oaklawn, investigators uncovered a mass grave, at least a dozen plain wooden coffins in a single feature, in an area the cemetery's own maps left blank. The remains were exhumed with forensic care. Researchers began the slow work of analyzing the bones and, where possible, attempting to extract DNA to connect these nameless dead to living descendants. Now hold those two things together, the testimony and the trench, and you will see exactly where the dispute lives. The conventional explanation, the one offered in 1921 and clung to for decades, was that some 36 people died, most of them buried properly, the violence regrettable but contained. The trouble is that this explanation cannot hold the facts. It cannot explain the Red Cross's far higher counts of dead and missing. It cannot explain the funeral director's accounts of burials without records. It cannot explain why a mass grave exists at all in ground that was supposed to be empty. When the official story and the physical earth disagree this sharply, it is the official story that has to answer for the gap. So both sides, and there are two serious sides here, begin from the same admission. The old number was a lie. They part ways on what the true number is, and on what the graves finally prove. Let me state the case of those who believe the massacre was far larger and more deliberately concealed than even the Commission concluded, and let me state it at full strength. They point to the convergence of independent sources, survivor testimony, Red Cross figures, mortuary accounts, and now the graves themselves, all pointing in the same direction, toward a death toll in the hundreds rather than the dozens. They argue that the very existence of an unrecorded mass grave is proof of intent. You do not accidentally bury a dozen people and forget to write it down. They see the clipped newspaper page, the denied claims, the blank cemetery map, and the 50 years of silence as a single coordinated act of erasure. To them, every nameless coffin is a document the city tried to destroy and failed. It is a powerful argument. It fits the pattern we have traced, and much of it is simply, demonstrably true. Now let me give the skeptics their due and not a straw man version, the careful one. The careful skeptic is not a denier. No serious person now denies the massacre happened or that the toll was undercounted. The careful skeptic simply insists that the graves prove less than the strongest claims want them to. A mass grave, they note, is consistent with a chaotic emergency burial during an epidemic of death and the collapse of normal services. Terrible, but not necessarily a clandestine plot to hide a specific number. They caution that until the bones are dated, identified, and tied by forensic evidence directly to the events of June 1921, we cannot be certain these particular dead are massacre victims at all, rather than the ordinary indigent burials of a poor district. They warn, rightly, that grief and a century of justified anger can shape memory, and that round numbers like 300 have hardened into certainty without proof. They ask us to let the science finish before we carve a number in stone. And here is the honest difficulty. Both of these positions are held by serious people, and the evidence, as it stands today, does not fully resolve them. We know there was a massacre. We know the toll was hidden. We know there is at least one mass grave where the records swore there was none. What we do not yet know, what the trials and the laboratories are still working to learn, is the full count and the precise degree of deliberate concealment in the burying of these specific dead. The difference between an emergency and a cover-up can come down to a single document that was never written, and you cannot excavate a document that does not exist. So I will not tell you which side is right, because I do not honestly know, and neither, yet, does anyone. What I can tell you is that the ground is still being read. More test sites remain. More remains await analysis. The DNA work is ongoing. And somewhere in this city there are living people whose great-grandparents may be lying in those boxes, waiting to be named. The earth is finally being made to testify. We are only now learning how to listen. Let us step back now, away from the trench, away from the laboratory, and ask the larger question, the one that outlasts any single number. What does it mean that this had to be dug up at all? A society reveals itself not in what it does in a moment of fury, but in what it chooses to remember afterward. The fire was 18 hours. The forgetting was 50 years. And the forgetting was, in its way, the deeper crime, because the fire could be blamed on a mob, on a moment, on the worst of a single night, while the forgetting required the patient, sober cooperation of the best of the city, the respectable, the educated, the men who signed the documents and taught the children. The fire was an eruption. The silence was a decision, renewed every single day that no one spoke. So suppose the strongest version of this story is true. Suppose the dead truly number in the hundreds, and the graves are exactly what the survivors always said they were. Then we are standing over proof that an American city destroyed a community, hid the bodies, blamed the victims, and successfully erased the act from its own memory for 2 generations, and very nearly forever. If that is true, then the comforting idea that the truth always comes out is itself a kind of fairy tale. The truth comes out only when someone refuses to let it stay buried. But suppose the careful skeptics are right in their caution, that some of these particular graves will prove to be ordinary, that the number will settle lower than the angriest estimates. Even then, do not mistake that for relief. Even the most conservative, honest reading leaves us with a massacre, a deliberate undercount, a clicked page, denied claims, and decades of engineered silence. The smaller story is still a story of a nation that found it easier to forget its dead than to face them. There is no version of this that lets us off the hook. There is only the question of how heavy the hook is. And yet, this is the part I want to leave with you. The story survived anyway. Think about how. It did not survive in the textbooks. They left it out. It did not survive in the newspapers. They clipped the page. It did not survive in the official record. The record said the ground was empty. It survived in kitchens. It survived in the low voices of grandmothers who had learned that some truths could only be spoken at home, passed hand to hand like a candle down a long dark hall, from people who had every reason to let it die and chose, instead, to keep it lit. That is the thing no ordinance can rezone and no grand jury can dismiss. You can burn the buildings. You can deny the claims. You can cut the page from the archive and leave the cemetery map blank. But you cannot easily kill a story that a community has decided to carry. Memory, it turns out, is the one piece of property they could not take. If this story has moved you, if you feel that low, cold weight of it settling in, then carry it the way those families did. Sit with it. Tell someone what you learned today. If you believe these forgotten histories deserve to be unearthed and spoken aloud, then stay with us here, subscribe, and let us keep doing this work together, one buried truth at a time. And I would ask you in the comments below to do something simple and powerful. If your own town has a story like this, a silence, a blank space on the map, an event the records would prefer you didn't know, tell us. That is how these things survive. That is how they always survived. Because in the end, this was never really a story about a fire. It was a story about 100 years of people choosing what to remember. And it is still being written, right now in a quiet cemetery in Tulsa, where the earth is being opened at last, and the nameless are, one by one, beginning to be given back their names.